All right. Well, welcome to all of our attendees. My dog decided that now would be a good time to start barking. So FYI, there's that. Um, so I just wanted to start by just welcoming everybody to Ready, Set, Vote. And we really see this as a celebration of voting and democracy. And we're so pleased that you all can join us. I'm the director of CWU's Museum of Culture and Environment. And we are really proud to partner with the Kittitas County League of Women Voters, the Associated Students of Central Washington University, and then also Law and Justice. Can't forget our representative from Law and Justice. And then thanks to you all for being here to educate yourselves, because educating yourself is what life is all about, really. So I wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement before we get started. So I'm just going to ask that we take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which Central Washington University resides is the historic home of the Yakima people. The federally recognized Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation are actually made up of the Klickitat, the Palouse, the Walla Walla, the Wanapum, the Wenatchee, the Wishram, and the Yakima people. And the Yakima people remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it and protecting it as instructed by elders through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. We give thanks to the legacy of the original people, their lives, and their descendants. So I just have a couple of announcements to make before we begin. And then I'm going to ask Lynn to help out with another announcement too. So that's 3 announcements total. I wanted to say first that the museum is actually reopening tomorrow with new exhibits. We'll open at 4:30 p.m. And here I'm going to drop inside the chat all the info you need for the hours and all the things, online exhibits, things like that. The 2 new exhibits are pretty near and dear to us. The one that we've been working on probably the longest is called Sustenance, the Material Culture of Food. And it features objects that have been stewarded by Central Washington University, in some cases for decades. And they're all objects that are related to food practices, eating food, serving food, hunting, fishing, gathering. So come check that out. And we are really excited to feature the photography of local photographer Rasan Burke. Rasan Burke has been taking photographs, well, of a lot of different situations in Ellensburg, but particularly of the demonstrations supporting Black Lives Matter down at the corner of 5th Avenue and Main Street in Ellensburg, and also taking photographs of the counter protests. So please stop by the museum and check out this really powerful photograph collage that Rasan has put together. And we couldn't be more overwhelmed with how powerful some of those images are, and how really it speaks to us as we see them all together in a collage. And then a second announcement is that on Friday, we do have another event that we are working with World Languages, CW World Languages and Cultures on. And this is going to be part of a series called The Art of Global Protest. This first Art of Global Protest event is on Belarus and the Belarusian elections of 2020. And we're going to be hearing from people who have been involved in the popular protests that happened after the wake of the August 9th elections, and who have been protesting against the, quote, last dictator in Europe, Alexander Lukashenko. And some of those people are going to be people who have been observing, like Irina Dmitrieva, as well as Anika Walke, who is at Washington University down in Missouri, who's a professor of history there. The moderator for that event will be our own Volha Isakova from World Languages and Cultures. So we're really excited about that. And I'll put in the chat here the link to register for that event. I'll turn it over to Lynn, who's going to talk a little bit about chat protocol. And Lynn, by the way, is the museum's collections manager.
Hi, I'm so glad that everybody's been able to make it to this event tonight. I'm going to be in the background watching the chat. We're going to not use the Q&A, so if you have questions for the panelists, please put them into the chat. If you want everybody to see them, make sure you've selected to all panelists and attendees. And then hopefully we'll be able to get to everybody's concerns and interests.
All right. So now I'm just gonna introduce all the panelists here. This wonderful group of people who have, I think, really educated me in the last week or so. Tonight's panelists include Charlie Sorensen and Catherine Murphy from the Kittitas County League of Women Voters. Edgar Espino, Nancy Canales Montiel, and Landis Hansen are from the Associated Students of Central Washington University. And our Sheffer Klarich is from CW Law and Justice. So I'm going to take a back seat as well, and I'm going to turn it over. We're going to start off hearing from our ASCW representatives. So thank you all.
Hello, everybody. My name's Edgar U. Espino. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the ASCW Director of Governmental Affairs. And I'll let the rest of my staff introduce themselves as well.
Hi, I'm Landis Hansen, he, him, his. I am the Civic Engagement Coordinator for ASCW Governmental Affairs.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nancy Canales Montiel, and I'm the Policy Director for ASCW Governmental Affairs.
What we do at Governmental Affairs is essentially we make sure students are civically engaged. A lot of that is making sure they're registered to vote, as well as hosting a civic engagement hub where students can come in. That will be hosted on November 2nd through November 3rd in Cirque 215. Make sure to bring a mask. And but essentially that's where it's college students can come and turn in their ballots if they need to. If they haven't printed out their ballots out, they can do that as well. And if they need to register to vote same day, they can do that as well.
Right, absolutely. And we also wanted to kind of talk about some important reasons to vote here in this election. We all know that this is kind of, hang on, let me pull up my PowerPoint here, or my notes, sorry. We all kind of recognize that this is an important election, but a lot of us aren't seeming to want to vote or register to vote. And historically, us as college students don't vote. And so there's some key reasons why we should vote specifically here in Kittitas. I am originally from Seattle, and when I moved here, I registered to vote here. The reason why I did that is because in King County, my vote is 3.4 times less powerful than here in Kittitas. Because of population differences and other factors, we have a lot more vote power here in Kittitas than much of the West Side. And due to that, I think it's super important that we vote here. We can have a much bigger impact on local politics. On top of that, we make up more than half of the population here in Ellensburg specifically. We make up 11,000 members of the 20,000 total population. And because of that, we have a huge opportunity to change the way things are run, which candidates provide which policies, and so I think that it's of the utmost importance that we make sure that we are heard. And unfortunately, most of the time we make up less than 50% of the voting group, even though we're more than 50% of the population. And what that translates into is policies such as disturbance laws here in Ellensburg. I'm sure many of you students have been approached by a police officer on a Friday night or a Saturday night in your home because you were playing music a little bit too loud and the noise ordinance doesn't allow you to play music or make even like I was having conversation with my friends and we got the cops called on us. And so I think those policies are in effect because a lot of time we don't vote. And unfortunately or positively, these policies affect us in our day-to-day lives.
The point he's making is very crucial for students because, for example, to be more specific for students is a couple years back, we actually wanted to start building a parking garage for Central Washington University. Unfortunately, we could not get the city to approve a 3-story building, and they still will not approve it. And when we asked why to City Council, they didn't really seem to care because they said simply students don't vote. Why should they care when students don't vote? So that's just kind of a bigger example of how our voting our voting power could affect us. And maybe if we come out to vote and actually elect city council members who do care about us and how much parking space we have, we could eventually get a parking garage. So it comes down to nitty-gritty things like that for student participation rates. But yeah, sorry, Landis, I just wanted to add that.
No, that was so valuable. Absolutely. And I think that's pretty much the end of my little spiel on why we should vote in Kittitas, but I know Nancy has some reasons why you should vote in general. So I'll pass it on over to you.
Yeah, so in general, we all know, obviously, because if we don't vote, it's not a democracy, simply, right? We have to acknowledge the fact that voting is not a right in this country. It is a privilege. Although we are a democracy, it is a privilege. A lot of people cannot vote. And most of I know in my Latinx community, people cannot vote. So if you can vote, you're voting on behalf of millions and millions of Americans who have lived their whole life here, yet they get no say. So that's kind of the beginning, right? You're voting for others. Not just that, I heard this quote that says, vote like your life depends on it. And honestly, I don't agree with it. Because we should be voting because all of our lives do depend on it. Not like it depends on it. It does depend on it. As we've seen, whether you like this administration or not, we're not doing great with this pandemic. Our economy is lowering, and it's time to make changes in leadership, and not just at the presidential level. The president affects us greatly. And I think this last administration has really shown how much it does affect us. But what really, really affects us is local and state elections. At the state level, in our office at Governmental Affairs, every single year we go down to Olympia and lobby on bills that support students. We don't lobby at a federal level. We lobby at a state level, which means the state representatives, Secretary of State, Treasurer, Governor, those people are directly in charge of policies that affect our education, that regulate our tuition, that regulate policies, funding for our schools. Those new buildings we're getting did not come out of nowhere. Those buildings came from capital requests that previous student lobbyists like me and Edgar lobbied for in the past. And we had to lobby representatives that we elected. Those representatives have to support students, and we have to make sure that we're voting for students, because if not, it comes down to that, not getting enough funding for our schools, programs, buildings, and simple things, bills that could help out students greatly. So I really, really highly encouraging paying a lot more attention to state and local elections, because those are what are affecting our day-to-day lives. From playing music being allowed to play music on a Friday night, to getting a parking garage, to school requirements and tuition regulation. Representatives at the state level control that, not the federal. So it's not only important to vote this election, but every single election, local and midterm as well. Yeah, that's kind of my spiel on local elections and the importance of that. Does anyone have any questions so far before we move forward? Okay, awesome. I'll pass it over to you, Edgar. Oh, sorry, Elena.
Yeah, Edgar can. I don't know if Edgar had anything right now. Did you?
Yeah, I guess I can add on one thing just to make sure, just to kind of slam the point why young people really should vote. Essentially, people between the ages of 18 and 24 are one of the largest voting blocks in the nation. They're the largest group of registered voters, yet at the same time, they're also the lowest demographic of voters in the entire nation. A lot of people tend to wonder why why there's not a lot of representation from our demographic when it comes to the poll. It just simply comes to the fact that we're not showing up to the polls when it needs. Just that a lot of young people in general don't care. I can definitely see that's changing, but in general, there needs more work to be done. And I'm just glad that being a part of ASCDU, I have the power, as well as my staff has the power, to do something about that on a local level.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So moving forward, let's talk about some things that are on the ballot, specifically the ballot measures. These are things that have a huge impact, and yet they're the longest to vote for on the ballot because you have to go through literature and literature and literature. So I've compiled some brief summaries of each of these ballot measures and their effect on students specifically. The first one that's on the ballot is Advisory Note 32. This is essentially a prohibition on the use of single-use plastic carryout bags by retailer establishments. What this means is that when you go to Fred Meyer's and you ask for a bag, they're here in Ellensburg are going to give you a plastic bag. The unfortunate part of these plastic bags is that they're not biodegradable. Instead, they deteriorate into little tiny particles that then end up in our national forests, our rivers, our lakes, and the Puget Sound. And this is terrible for wildlife. These things, again, they never break down. They never get transformed into anything else. And so they're just building up in these habitats. And so to combat this, the Washington State Legislature put together this bill so that single-use plastic carryout bags would be phased out in the next year. And instead, we would use recyclable, reusable carryout bags that have a certain percentage of recycled content. I believe that's about 30%, and then it's going to move up to 40% within a few years. So what these bags would allow for is if these happen to be discarded in a wrong fashion, they do biodegrade. On top of that, they are made out of recyclable material. This does mean for students a little bit of a fee. So every time you go and you get a bag, there's going to be a 8 cents, I believe it's an 8-cent charge, yes, to the customer for every single bag. And on top of this, what that means is that here at the C-store or here at the Wildcat shop, you will no longer be able to get plastic carryout bags. That's pretty much the gist of it. Yeah, so that's a statewide thing. Nancy, did you have anything else on that? No? Okay. Awesome. The next one is Advisory Note 33, which is one about renting heavy equipment. So this doesn't really apply to students that much. I don't think that many of us are out there renting caterpillars to dig a hole in our backyard. But it is on the ballot. It's a tax for heavy equipment rentals. And where these funds are going to be going is to the motor vehicle fund for the maintenance of our roads and highways and expansion of those facilities, as well as to the multimodal transportation account, which is for public transportation. So it's a 1.25% tax on heavy equipment rentals. And this translates into potentially better public transportation and better roads for us to travel on. That's pretty much the gist of it. If you have any questions on that one, go ahead and throw them into chat. It's a pretty boring bill, but yeah. The next one is 34, Advisory Vote 34, which is a tax on businesses for the use for the use of funding for higher education programs and incentives. So this tax actually goes directly to the Washington State grant and other forms of higher education funding. And so this is probably the most pertinent to students. This bill ensures funding for the Washington College Grant, which I'm sure some of you receive. It increases funding for higher education incentives, ensures appropriate funding for higher education. It also, for small businesses, relieves tax a little bit. It makes the tax code easier to understand, and raises the income threshold, so that a lot of small businesses do not need to pay this tax. On top of that, it charges, it creates a surcharge, which is a percentage on top of tax to large advanced computing businesses such as Amazon, Valve, Microsoft, these sorts of companies. And so this tax is going to create a whole bunch of funding for us to use as students for our higher education facilities, including trade schools to use to educate us. That in turn translates into more businesses wanting to come here to Washington to take advantage of our educated population. And so in the long run, it creates jobs and also increases funding for you and me. I'm very passionate about this one. I can't say that. I was going to say I like it, but I can't say that.
So actually,
Go ahead, Nancy.
we can say that because our committee, Central Washington University, our students under the Student Legislative Advocacy Committee actually voted to lobby for that bill, which means Central supports it. And the reason we did that is because it is more than $1 billion of funding into education. It is the largest investment in education any state has ever made. So go us. And to explain that tax policy a little more, basically in short terms, this bill will tax any big businesses that use college degrees that require college degrees to function. For example, Amazon needs computer scientists, Microsoft needs engineers. So thus they will pay a tax that will fund those STEM programs that will get them those workers. Small businesses will not be affected as much because, like I said, any business that uses most of their staff or employees requiring bachelor's and above will pay that tax. So that's a really important distinction to be made, because there's this misconception that taxes on businesses will go up, but that's not true. It's just the big businesses that can afford it. And those big businesses actually helped us lobby for them. They requested this bill because they want more employees in the future. So yeah, and to really connect with students on that is this money will fund FAFSA and WASFA and other financial aid programs. So if you're receiving FAFSA now, you might have noticed that that you might get more financial aid money, or in the future you will. It is because of this bill. So that advisory note is actually something that students chose to support through Central Washington University. And Jay Inslee actually bragged about it during the presidential debate. So it is a really big deal. He took credit of our work. But yeah, anyways, sorry, that was a really important one. You're muted, Landis.
I am muted. It is absolutely super important for us to understand, and because it directly impacts us. The next one is another one that doesn't affect us as much, but it is a tax on aerospace businesses. And now people are going to say, oh, taxes, oh, it's no good, it's going to drive jobs away. But actually this one puts us in full compliance with World Trade Organization rulings, which actually then means less tariffs on aerospace companies like Boeing and other companies. So what this means is actually it benefits these big companies, meaning that they are probably going to be more likely to hire people, more likely to expand jobs in Washington because they are in compliance with World Trade Organization requirements. And so this, the effects on Washington State is it helps maintain employment through Washington State from those retaliatory tariffs that are imposed if you don't meet the requirements for the World Trade Organization. So it's actually a beneficial tax for everybody. It's good for Boeing, it's good for us, and it means more jobs in the future. The next one we're going to look at is the first referendum. And this is Washington State Referendum number 90. And this one seems to have a lot of discussion about it because it is a sex education bill. And the purpose of this is to require age-appropriate, inclusive, and medically and scientifically accurate comprehensive sexual education in grade schools here in Washington. There is a parental opt-out. So if parents don't want their kids enrolled in this, they can opt out. But what this means is that K through 12 is going to get education on things relating to sexual health. Now, what does this mean for kindergartners? Why are you teaching kindergartners sex ed? Well, for kindergartners, it's actually more about consent, right? They're going to be teaching kids about don't just grab somebody's hand. You need to ask your friend if you can hold their hand, right? It's going to be teaching about all these different sorts of things, which then build up into more ready for society kids. This also helps educate kids on what an abusive relationship is, and it helps them identify those red flags, which then they can turn around into making their lives better and getting out of abusive relationships like that, or seeing those red flags early on. Go ahead, Nancy.
Sorry. I do want to point out that this bill was also a bill that students at Central Washington University chose to be lobbied on last year. It passed, and there's this huge movement of people that don't really like the bill for their own personal, or most of the time it's religious reasons. But like Linda said, there is an opt-out option. What it is, it's from K to 12. It is a brand new comprehensive curriculum developed by doctors. And it is, again, record-setting the most comprehensive sexual education curriculum developed in the United States. It will make Washington #1. The way it relates to students, because although it does not relate to higher education after, post high school. If we educate students and generations from an early age for family life, healthy and sexual education, then STD rates in college are proven to go down, as well as teen pregnancies and other, numbers such as sexual assault cases and harassment decreases in college campuses once students come to campuses already prepared and educated on such topics. There's a lot of misconceptions with that bill, saying that it is inappropriate for students, but obviously it's K to 12 age appropriate. It's just introducing concepts earlier has proven to be more effective. But yeah, that is a really important referendum. But yeah, we can get into it later if anyone has any other questions.
Yeah. So that's, like she said, hugely important, and she summed it up better than I ever could. So the next one we're going to be looking at is, what is this one called? This is 8212, I believe. Oh, this is the wrong one. 1 second. This one is, Washington Senate Joint Resolution 8212. And what this one is it is a referendum on, or a joint resolution on where long-term care money can be held and deposited. So we in Washington State have a long-term care fund, which basically supplies money to elderly and disabled persons. And this referendum posits or proposes that this public money should be able to be invested in private companies and stocks. What this means is that it, again, allows this public money to be invested in these stocks, and this allows for potential faster growth of these funds. However, it also means higher risk. So right now, they're only allowed to be invested in public bonds and other public funds, which then mature and collect interest. And those are much more stable investments, but moving it over to these private companies and stocks would potentially, like I said, allow for faster growth with higher risk involved. And so it really does not have any effect on students directly. It will have an effect on our elderly. I know both my bubby and my grandma are now in long-term care facilities, and so that's who this concerns, right? And yeah, that's I don't have much on this one because it doesn't really pertain to students that much. But if any of our other panelists have anything on that one, go ahead and take the space. That doesn't seem like we do. Okay, I will transition back over to Edgar for his thing.
All right, yeah, just a reminder, everyone, for the resources that we have on campus as well. We have in ASW office, we have a voting information center. That is essentially where students on campus can come into the student gov office. That is Circ 236. If they have any questions about their ballots, how to fill out their ballot, as well as like how to register to vote and how to fill out that information. If they have any questions pertaining to elections, they can come help us as well. We can help them out with that as well. In addition to that, like I said earlier, we will have the student engagement hub on campus at Circ 215. That is the Circ Ballroom from November 2nd to November 3rd, where students can come in and they can turn in their ballots. They can print off ballots if they haven't printed them out, as well as register same day to vote, as we will have the Kittitas County Auditor there as well, doing same day voter registration. We're also looking for volunteers as well, and we're currently in the process of making the volunteer sign-up sheet. So if any of y'all are interested in volunteering at the Student Engagement Hub, just let me know. You can email me at ascw.governmental@cw.edu if you have any more information on that. And also just a reminder, if anyone here is not registered to vote as well, I'm going to drop the link to online voter registration in the state of Washington. That is votewa.gov. So if anyone hasn't registered yet, I would urge so to do now, because the last day to register online is October 26th. And with that, I yield my time.
So Landis and Edgar, I think I go next. Is that right? In the order? Okay, I'm Catherine Murphy. I'm with the League of Women Voters, and I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to find the right screen. Just a second. This is always the hardest part. Here it is. Okay, here we go. And thank you for inviting us to today. The League of Women Voters has been around for 100 years. We organize, there are people from all kinds of political parties that work together to gain the votes for women. And we formed the organization just before the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. And we formed it because we figured there's all these people who are going to need to be educated about how to be good citizens, how to be civically engaged. And then we figured we would go and work in our own political parties and kind of fizzle out. Well, it turns out the people who ran those political parties weren't all that interested in having women join them. And so while education is the bedrock of what we do, empowering voters, defending a democracy, we also have an advocacy aim where we do some study and through consensus figure out how we're going to advocate for particular issues. As far as that goes, but we never oppose or endorse parties and candidates. And so we're very interested in making sure that civic engagement happens for all people. There have been great reasons why voting matters, and I totally endorse everything that everyone said here. I think one of the basic things is that voting is the minimum responsibility of being citizens. There are other ones, but voting is your minimum way in. And it also helps us keep people that we elect accountable. We can say, I voted for you, you know, and they're going to listen to us. So a few historical points. Our right to vote is not enshrined in the Constitution. This often surprises people. Election and voting law is made at the state level. and it's administered at the county level. And this goes to reinforce what Nancy said with regard to why it's important to vote in those state and local areas. In Washington state, we have very good access to the ballot, although there is still voter suppression here, but it's done more subtly because we have elected people who do that. The founders, when they established the Constitution, didn't trust everyone to vote. And in fact, since it was at the state level, the state set what the requirements were. And in 1789, those requirements be that you were white, that you were male, that you were over 21, and that you owned property. And some states required that you be literate as well. So your vote really is your voice. And I think I have my slides out of order, which isn't surprising considering what I did. So let's start. Oops. So in 1870, African-American men and formerly enslaved people could not vote until 1870. White women could not vote until 1920. And we say white women because although Black women were included in that, the Jim Crow laws that happened between 1870 and 1920 had eroded the ability of people to vote in those areas. Many people don't realize that Asian Americans and Native Americans couldn't vote until 1950 and 1960s. One of the personal notes for me is my father was born in 1924, a white man in Washington, D.C. But in Washington, D.C., there is no representation to this day for those people who live there in Congress. And it wasn't until 1961 that the citizens in Washington, D.C. could vote for president or vice president. When my father moved to Washington in 1956, he was so excited and registered to vote. He was so excited, in fact, and registered to vote that he decided to run for office. So as a 5-year-old, I wandered around the neighborhoods with these little literature things saying, please vote for my daddy. And so that gives me a certain understanding of why it's important to do this, why it's important to participate, because it was one of my family's values. And that was reinforced through the civic education that I received when I was a young person, which is only now starting again in Washington state after decades of it being lapsed. People who are 18 and 20 couldn't vote until 1971. And when I get done speaking, Charles is going to talk about the fact that our voting rights can be eroded and removed because it is not enshrined in the Constitution. And in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby v. Holder that some parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the enforcement mechanisms were changed or revoked, but Charles is going to talk about that. One of the things that many people don't know, you talked a little bit about the voting groups and the voting blocks. Voter participation is really important. Turnouts, we're going to see lots of stories about how many people are turning out. Well, those turnout numbers are always about the number of people registered versus the number of people who voted. But we don't talk about the number of people who don't register. In 52, 91% of Washington's voting age population were registered. By 2016, only 77% were registered, which meant that in 2016, when you figure that in, only 61% of our citizens actually made the decisions in that election. That doesn't represent all of us. And so that's why it's so important to have everybody vote. In Kittitas County, through the work of many people, including the students at Central and the League of Women Voter and other groups, we've steadily increased the number of registered voters from 2012 at 20,000 up here to the presidential primary of 27,000. But even so, we're still looking at turnout numbers. Remember, there's another 20% that aren't registered here. So the turnout is probably more like 40% for that presidential primary rather than the 52%. That means that the minority is deciding for the rest of us. Voting is really difficult in this country, and a lot of people don't recognize that. We have many more elections and many more races than in other countries. So it is difficult. And these PowerPoints with the links will be in the notes below. The other thing is that we pay attention to national news rather than local news. So it's hard to get information about candidates and parties locally. The really big part that the League has done is this second point, decreased civics education in schools since 1980. Civics was not a required topic to graduate from the late 1970s in Washington until this year. Think about that. The school districts could do it or not do it as they like. And that changed recently. It changed as the result of many organizations, including educational organizations, to create the Civics Education Bill 1896 that was passed in 2018. It restores social studies to the elementary school. Remember, in elementary school, elementary classrooms weren't required to teach social studies until this point. It embeds asking questions and analysis throughout the social studies classes. And it develops, and it's developed a model that is being implemented this year for a 1 semester standalone high school civics class. So in our state, a generation and a half of people went through without having this important information available, which really suppressed who was going to vote. So if you didn't grow up in a family like mine, where voting was one of the 3 things my parents expected us to do at the end of our life, we have to be kind, we have to give blood, and we have to vote. They would be happy with us if we did those 3 things as adults. But a lot of people didn't grow up in families like mine. So this access is going to help. One of the really important pieces of research, and I know that Edgar has read this along with other people, is that the 4 research-backed ways to get people to vote are to educate early and well. So that's the civics education piece. The other is peer pressure. You know, if I say I'm going to do this, people are going to go, oh, well, I respect or like Catherine, so I might think about doing that. Having healthy competition, which means good candidates are running. And, you know, really asking people, are you going to vote? Maybe not ask them, are you going to vote for the same person, but are you going to vote? Because your vote is important. There's lots of ways you can participate. You can start conversations. And when I say be a responsible digital publisher, and I'm sure that you know this, every time we put something on Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever, we become a digital publisher and we become responsible for the information we share. And I think about it every time before I hit post when I do that. I think the most important other thing is to ask others to join you in voting. I think that's a very critical place that we can help. This is a quote from one of my teachers. We can all be leaders. So you have the opportunity inside your circle of influence to influence other people to also vote, as well as making sure that you vote in every election. A leader is anyone who's willing to help, anyone who sees something that needs to change and takes steps to influence that situation. I really believe that that is true. And one of the ways that we can influence the situation is, and I'm going to turn this over to Charles unless there's questions, is that right now, and I'm going to go back to this slide that I had earlier here, which is this one, the one about Shelby v. Holder. So we think, oh, well, we all have the right to vote. But remember, election law is set at the state level, and how hard or easy it is to register to vote or to actually get to the ballot box happens at the state and local level. And that is being impacted by the decisions being handled down by Congress right now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Charles. No, Robert, sorry. I don't know why I said Charles.
I was just about to ask, did you?
That's okay. I have the wrong name.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
fine. I'll be Charles for the night. That sounds exciting. So I thought you maybe were trying to throw it to Charlie, but so yeah, thanks. That's a great introduction. And like Kevin, no Catherine, I'm going to share my screen as well because we've arrived. Oh, there it is. Okay. We've arrived at kind of the bummer portion of the night, unfortunately, because you may be aware of a number of incidences of voter suppression recently. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the number of polling places were reduced from in the hundreds, in the 100 range, down to fewer than 10. Most recently in Texas, although this is still undergoing federal appeal, the governor of Texas reduced the number of ballot boxes to 1 for every county of ballot drop boxes, regardless of size. And so the city of Houston, which previously had 12 ballot boxes for its several million residents, now only has 1. And so I want to talk about a major reason that this is happening. And this is a case from 2013, Shelby County v. Holder. And Catherine gave us a really great introduction to this idea, but I just want to remind everybody that The interplay between the federal government and the state governments is a little bit more complicated than many people realize, because it's true that the Constitution contains a supremacy clause. Federal law is supreme over state law, but there's a very narrow range of topics that the federal government is allowed to pass laws on. If we're talking about the United States Congress, only those subjects identified in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution can the United States Congress legislate on. And they're relatively few. They can establish a post office, they can regulate issues of interstate commerce, but unless something appears in Article 1, Section 8, the federal government can't really act on it. And so while state governments have theoretically inferior power to the federal government, they have a much broader range of topics that they're allowed to legislate on. And because that limitation is constitutional, the only thing that can change it is a constitutional amendment. And those are relatively rare. We've only had 27 in our history. 10 of them were passed more or less contemporaneously with ratification of the Constitution. And further, most constitutional amendments don't expand congressional power. They actually restrict it. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of a religion. It's restricting the number of things that Congress can regulate. Which brings us to, again, something Catherine introduced us to, which is the Civil War amendments. As the Civil War concluded and in its relatively immediate aftermath, Congress passed 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th, abolishing slavery, the 14th, which does a ton of things, but relevant today, it forces states to guarantee their citizens equal protection under the laws, and the 15th, which extends the right to vote to men regardless of their race. And importantly, all of these amendments contain some variation of the language, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So there is that expansion of Congress's ability to legislate as long as it relates to one of those subject matters. And you see right there, the 15th Amendment, right? You can vote regardless of your race. And you might think, okay, well, all the states that had systemically oppressed people previously would just throw up their hands and say, well, the jig is up. I guess we have to let people vote, right? Of course not. During the 1800s and early 1900s, as a part of this Jim Crow legislation, as well as other pieces of legislation, there were pervasive and repeated attempts to suppress the vote that included poll taxes, literacy tests. I have an example up on the screen. There should also be an example down in the chat that were functionally impossible to complete, especially because they were timed. If you were in debt, the franchise would be denied you, and some of the southern states tried to claim that all formerly enslaved persons were in debt because, according to them, they owed back room and board as a condition of that former condition of slavery. The franchise was often denied if you had any sort of criminal history, and of course, there were lots of informal attempts to I'm getting some chat here. Let me make sure we're doing okay. Sorry, I can't really see the chat. Can anybody tell me, is there anything that needs?
I was just saying that I can't seem to upload PDFs. So
Okay.
I'm going to try to figure out a workaround.
I can post some links after this is done. So no worries there. And I think it's relevant to note that these effects extended beyond simply the right to vote, which of course is a crucial right, because some states, although my colleague Charlie Sorensen told me this isn't the case in Washington State, some states assemble their jury pools from the voter registration list. And so in 1955, after the murder of a young black man, Emmett Till, the trial for his murderer, Roy Bryant, contained no black jurors because at the time there were no black Americans registered to vote in the jurisdiction in Mississippi. And so often, not only does it deprive us of our ability to obviously participate in a representative democracy, but it can have other effects as well. Which brings us to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is an attempt pursuant to that expansion of congressional power to remedy some of the systemic and pervasive injustices. It did a lot of things, and many of them at the national level, but for the purpose of Shelby County v. Holder, there are two main provisions that really take center stage. The first is Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which recognized that there were some states and some counties that had a long history of voter suppression, a long history of acting shady, or as the kids say these days, sus. And if there was a state that was particularly shady or a county that was particularly shady, it warranted special attention. And we call this the coverage formula. And really the coverage formula was created by examining states that had previously used tests or devices like those literacy tests to interfere with lawful voting, or states or localities where less than 50% of the population had been registered to vote, or less than 50% of the population had voted in the most recent presidential general election. Importantly, it also contained provisions allowing states or localities to bail out from the coverage formula if they could prove good behavior. And it also contained provisions that would bail states or localities in if they had bad behavior after the enactment of the Voting Rights Act. So what happened if you were a suspicious state or locality? Section 5 required all of the states and localities covered under Section 4 to pre-clear any changes they wanted to make to their voting practices or procedures with the federal government. And so this acted as an important check. It's often said our government is one of checks and balances. This was a check for any state or locality that had acted badly in the past. Before they could change anything, we had to make sure that there was a review of that potential change. So I have up here on the map what the coverage formula was as it existed in 1975, the last time it was changed. You see every area in red were statewide covered entities. Those in purple were counties that had townships that were subject to Section 5, and in blue were counties that had that were subject to Section 5. And you'll note that in some of the red areas, notably in Virginia, there were counties that had successfully bailed out of the coverage formula. In fact, historically, when a county bailed out, so long as they actually had been acting, had been good actors for a sustained period of time, the federal government didn't contest that. The federal government would often join in the effort for that county or that state to bail out. So originally, the Voting Rights Act was only supposed to last for 5 years. There's a number of amendments and extensions. Importantly for the case, the coverage formula under Section 4B was largely unchanged since 1975 up through 2013. Two 25-year extensions, first in 1982, and then a second 25-year extension in 2006. Okay, that brings us to the case in which, in Alabama County, brought what's called a facial challenge to the constitutionality of Section 4B and Section 5. Why does that matter? Well, remember, states and counties had the ability to bail out if they wanted to, and many successfully had. But this Alabama county isn't seeking to bail out, it's seeking to have the law struck down in toto. And ultimately, the Supreme Court upholds the pre-clearance requirement under Section 5, but strikes down the coverage formula under Section 4B. And so as it stands, there's a pre-clearance requirement that applies to absolutely nobody, because there's absolutely nobody covered under Section 4B. The court found, and Catherine gave us a good introduction to this, that ultimately the Voting Rights Act exceeded the constitutional power granted under the 14th and 15th Amendments. That, as Catherine noted, this was ultimately a states' right issue. And because voting laws occur at the state level, and because the court felt that the Congress had kind of too liberally interpreted their granted power under the 15th Amendment, it was inappropriate. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion and noted somewhat uncomfortably that we were treating states differently based on conditions as they existed the last time the Voting Rights Act was materially changed, which was 1975. And Chief Justice John Roberts said, there's a lot that's changed since 1975. Conditions aren't the same as they existed in 1975. I want to highlight some of the key language here. I won't read it aloud to you, but again, Roberts noting some discomfort with the fact that the country has changed since 1975. And his interpretation that the amendment, being the 15th Amendment, is not designed to punish states for what's happened in the past, but rather to ensure a better future, and that legislation should be proactive rather than reactive. Justice Thomas wasn't satisfied with simply striking down Section 4B. He would have struck down Section 5, the pre-clearance requirement, as well. But I want to highlight language from the recently departed Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I think very presciently noted in her dissent that throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And what has happened since Shelby County v. Holder? It started to rain. And in the almost immediate aftermath, this map shows the closing of polling places from 2012 to 2016. So in the immediate aftermath, we've seen dramatic reductions in the number of polling places. Today, we're grappling with attempted limitations on mail-in voting, limitations on drop box availability, curtailment of early voting periods, the elimination of Sunday voting in some states. We've seen sort of wholesale efforts to suppress the vote. And because the pre-clearance requirement no longer applies to anybody, there's no ability to check that. If a state decides they want to do it, there's nothing at present not only to stop them, but to even require them to run that idea by anybody. They just get to do it without any sort of check. So, where are we headed? Well, gerrymandering is not something covered under the Voting Rights Act, but we've seen the court do similar things with gerrymandering, which is to say, this is a states' right issue. If you don't like what's happening in your state, vote the people who are making decisions out. We're not going to step in to stop anything. We call this the political question doctrine, the idea that, generally speaking, the Supreme Court, recognizing that it's not accountable to any electorate, kind of defers to decision makers like representatives and senators, like governors, who are accountable to the electorate. Section 5 still exists at present. Theoretically, a new coverage formula could be developed, and I think Roberts indicated that he wasn't necessarily opposed to the idea of a new coverage formula. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg is gone, almost certain to be replaced now with Amy Coney Barrett, who I think probably, if push comes to shove, thinks a little bit more like Clarence Thomas than she does like John Roberts. And so while Section 5 and pre-clearance still exists now, I can't guarantee that in the future it will. And I want to close because, unfortunately, for whatever reason, the idea of voting and the idea that everybody should vote has become politicized and has become controversial. And I think it's worth remembering that Susan B. Anthony really recalled the preamble to the Constitution and the idea that we set out on this endeavor to secure the blessings of liberty, not only for ourselves, but for our posterity, for our children, for my sons, Milo and Oscar, who are watching upstairs, for Ellie and Olivia, who are watching from afar. But that importantly, it's not to give this right to vote to the half of ourselves, the half of our posterity, but to the whole of the people. And back then she was speaking to women as well as men. But I think it's crucial that we recognize that if we are to hold the right to vote as important, as fundamental, then it is up to us to ensure that that ability to vote isn't just secured to us, but secured to all of us, for ourselves and for the generations to come. Unfortunately, I think Shelby County v. Holder at least at present, makes that somewhat more difficult. But I'm hopeful that that won't always be the case.
Thank you, Robert. I think it's my turn. I know we're running long, so I'll try and be really brief. I want to endorse everything that's already been said tonight. Voting is important. It's a right that we are awarded as citizens of this country. And if we don't vote, we have less and less of a democracy and more of an oligarchy. So we need to vote. And I'm going to put in the chat quick notes on how to register to vote. As Edgar's already said, you can go to votewa.gov and do it online if you have a Washington State driver's license. If you don't have a Washington State driver's license, you can go to the Secretary of State's website and download the print version of the voter registration form. And the third way you can do this is simply go to the Kittitas County Auditor's Office when they're open and register in person. And you can do that right up until 8 p.m. on November 3rd and still vote in this upcoming election. And we really urge you to do that. Voting is something that those of us who weren't modeled voting by our parents, it seems hard. And I really appreciate Landis and Nancy's review of some of the stuff that is going to be on your ballot. And I wanted to share a sample ballot with you really quickly. Nope, that isn't it. Okay. Can you see this sample ballot? Please nod, panelists, if you can. Great. Okay. So they went through
what we're actually seeing is a voter registration form, Charlie.
That's all you're seeing?
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. How about this? Okay, let's try it again. There's a couple things about the, yeah, I think that's it. The ballot. Can we see the ballot now?
Totally, you got it.
Okay, great. Things to remember are, in order for these to be counted quickly and through our systems that are set up to handle this, please use blue or black ink and fill in the box completely. No check marks, no X marks, no pencils, no red pens, no purple pens, none of that stuff. You don't have to vote for everybody here. If you don't feel that you can make an informed decision, you can skip and fill somebody else in. Fill in a race where you feel comfortable. And the other thing is, in Washington State, you can write in Santa Claus and your best friend's name, but unless that person is actually filed to run as a write-in candidate, they will not be counted. So it's a waste of everybody's time to do that. It might seem like a fun thing to do, but it doesn't get anything anywhere. It just makes more work for our election staff. So that's the first thing I want to show you. The next thing is that being a citizen and voting in any election presupposes that you do have to do a little bit of homework. And homework means doing some research on what are your ballot choices, who's running for office. And as we said, the League of Women Voters never ever endorses or opposes political candidates or parties at any level, but we do try to make looking up the information easy for you. So I'm showing you our website, and we have a 2020 election voters guide, and where we have put up, again, a link to the sample ballot, links to the Secretary of State's website, a whole bunch of lovely links, including plain language of these referendums and advisory votes. And when it comes down to candidates, we will link to their campaign website if they have one, their Facebook campaign if they have one, PDC, which is the Public Disclosure Commission. If you want to see who's paying to get somebody elected or who's running against them, you can look at that up. It's often very instructive, especially up here on some of these ballot measures. Looking at who's paying to get this passed or who's paying to get it opposed or rejected is very instructive, and I really encourage you to look that stuff up. But we also link to candidate statements. If these candidates participated in a league forum, we'll link to that video. And if the state races, if they've participated in a league forum, we link to those as well so that you can look at the lieutenant governor debate. So this is sort of a one-stop place. So we did all the hunting up of the information. All you have to do is click the link and do some homework. And one of the other really crucial things I think you need to get in the habit of doing is making that's the wrong one, I'm sorry, is making a candidate help me out here, a candidate not postcard, a candidate
Checklist.
Yeah,
Like
a
a
checklist,
candidate, yeah.
right? Because you want to know what is it you are looking for in a candidate. Here we go. Do you want them to have integrity, honesty? Do you want them to have experience in the position? Do a little bit of side, okay, so what does a county commissioner do? What does a lieutenant governor do? Are these candidates adequate for that? Do they have the qualities I want in a candidate? And once you've got that decided, you've done a little homework, you can start completing your ballot. And in Washington State, you get the ballots roughly 18 days before the election. Most of us got ours in this county by the 16th. And certainly, I think the post office, you don't have to worry about them getting it delivered on time. However, everybody across the state has said, if you haven't voted and there's only 5 days left, put it in a ballot drop box so that you're absolutely certain your ballot gets to the election office within the time frame. And I'm going to wrap that up since we're running long, unless there's any questions.
I think we can open it now and see if any attendees have questions just in general.
The chat is full of great information, but so far nobody's come forward with a question.
You all have answered the questions. Okay, so someone asks, can you share, Chris Ernst asks, can you share again the locations of ballot boxes on campus? In the CERC and also near county offices.
Okay, I can attest for the one on the CERC. We have one, I believe it's the east patio. It's the one where with the Wildcat statue is on. We have a ballot box drop there. That fun fact, that is actually one of the first ballot drop box to ever be put on a state university.
Yeah. There's also one right outside the courthouse, and in the courthouse, you can also drop off your ballot. It is kind of, what direction is that? West of the entrance, over on the south side of the parking lot there. Oh, there we go.
That is really helpful. I just took a screenshot of that. I think I'm going to share that on my Facebook feed. So I really appreciate that. I'll cut everybody's faces out since we didn't expect to have a screenshot there, but that was really great.
The other thing about the ballot drop boxes is they're all listed on the Kittitas County Auditor's webpage under elections. So a complete listing of all the ballot drop boxes are there.
And if you happen to be in any other place right now, some of us are going to school remotely, you can drop your ballot into any legitimate drop box, which is what we have here, and it will get to the right county. And if you're close on that date, it's better to put it in a drop box than to trust that it will be postmarked. So if you happen to be in Seattle or Walla Walla or someplace else, that's where you're living while you go to school, you can still vote and put it in the drop box locally.
Wow.
There is also this master list, which I'm going to drop into chat right now, from the Secretary of State. And from there, you can look up your county and your city and see if you have a Dropbox near you.
All right. Well, I think our final message is to encourage, my dog really wants to do this, encourage everybody to vote. He's excited about it, even though I don't think dogs can vote at this point, but
That would be great. And if you do vote, you can then go to votewa.gov, put in your information, and you can track your ballot status. So you can see exactly when your ballot has been officially accepted at the local election office. They'll have a return date and it'll say accepted. So if you don't see that and you've turned it in, you can call the auditor or go to the office and go, help.
And I
Thank
have
you.
one more thing to remind people. Your signature needs to match the signature they have on file, okay? And so think about that when you sign that. It's also important to put your phone number there because this is a voter intent state. So if it turns out your signature does not match, the elections office is going to try to get in touch with you to make sure that you can come in and correct your ballot. So first, when you register to vote, think about what your legal signature is and what you want it to look like. If you registered when you got your driver's license, that's the signature to use. And if you get that email or you get that letter or that phone call, take care of it right away. It means your ballot will still count. But voting, that's another way that's a checkup there. So thank you.
Which is another good reason to vote early. So, all right. Well, I just wanted to, I know that we can't really give a formal like applause, but jazz hands for those who are muted and applause for those who aren't. Just thank you all so very much for doing this. I'm gonna be excited to post this onto YouTube to let people know. And yeah, you know, just thanks for all the work that you all have been doing to educate, to let people know what issues matter and what students should be thinking about, and to just promote voting.
If I might, right here at the end, I would encourage everybody, panelists and attendees, to go and get one of your family members, one of your friends, tell them about why they should vote. Make sure to do that, and we'd be great in Washington. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's an excuse to talk to your family. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And if anyone wants to stick around and talk a little bit more about voting, I'm sure my dog would love to join in that conversation.